The waitress was fired for theft on a luxury cruise, and the millionaire saw her necklace, the same one he had given his daughter before she disappeared 20 years ago. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The Star of the Caribbean displayed its elegant silhouette over the moonlit ocean, while inside the grand hall, opulence reigned. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling. The soft music of an orchestra floated in the air, blending with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Jessica Jones, in her perfectly pressed gray uniform, moved swiftly between the tables, serving drinks with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. To the guests, she was just another figure in the background, invisible, dispensable. But for Jessica, every step in that hall was a reminder of the dreams that still kept her going, saving enough to open a small cafe in her hometown. It wasn't a grand dream, but it was hers. However, that night, fate had other plans. As she leaned down to serve a burly man who barely acknowledged her, a sharp scream cut through the air, silencing the music and conversations. "My diamond necklace is missing." The hall fell into silence. All heads turned toward the source of the scandal. Margaret Montenegro, a socialite known for her arrogance, stood beside her table, her face pale with fury. Her eyes darted around the room before locking onto Jessica, who held a tray of half-empty glasses. "It was you. You stole my necklace," Margaret accused, pointing a trembling but firm finger at Jessica. The tray wobbled in Jessica's hands, and one of the glasses tipped over, spilling champagne onto her wrist. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. "I didn't take anything," she murmured, but her voice was a whisper lost in the rising murmurs. The ship's head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a stoic expression, appeared immediately, flanked by two guards. "Miss, you'll have to come with us," he said gravely. "I didn't do anything," Jessica repeated, louder this time. But her protest was drowned out by the growing judgment in the room. The crowd began whispering, some with amused smirks, others with furrowed brows, but all with the same silent condemnation. Margaret stepped closer, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "I know it was you. I saw you lurking around my table. Did you think no one would notice? Thief!" The head of security ordered her to empty her pockets. With trembling hands, Jessica obeyed, pulling out a small handkerchief, a pen, and her notepad. There was no sign of the necklace, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Search her room. She must have hidden it," she commanded, her voice dripping with disdain. The guards took Jessica by the arm, and, unable to defend herself any further, she was escorted out of the hall. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, not just because of the false accusation, but because of the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of all those people. But not everyone in the room was blinded by the scandal. Charles Davis, a business magnate with decades of success and an incalculable fortune, observed the scene from a secluded corner. His eyes, trained to see between the lines in business, caught something that others had overlooked: the small pendant hanging from Jessica's neck, swinging gently as she was led away. It was a simple pendant, a small silver locket with an inscription, but Charles recognized it instantly. His heart stopped for a second. That pendant was identical to the one he had specially made for his daughter, Susan, who had mysteriously disappeared 20 years ago. The world around Charles faded, leaving only that small object glimmering under the ballroom lights. "It can't be," he thought, as a mixture of hope and fear surged through him. The locket had a secret inscription on the back, something only he and Susan knew. How did it end up in the hands of that young waitress? Before he could react, Jessica disappeared through the doors, leaving Charles entangled in a web of memories and emotions. As the murmurs of the guests returned and the music resumed, Charles took a step forward, determined to follow her. But just as he was about to move, something stopped him. Among the crowd, a man in a dark suit with an unreadable expression watched him intently. He wasn't a typical guest. There was something about his presence, something in his stance, that didn't fit the forced elegance of the others. The man held Charles's gaze for a moment, then, with an enigmatic smile, turned and vanished among the guests, slipping away like a shadow in the night. A chill ran down Charles's spine. Who was that man? The coincidence was too great to ignore. The pendant, the waitress, the stare of that stranger. It was all connected in a way he didn't yet understand. As Jessica was taken to the security area of the cruise, her heart shattered and her dignity in pieces, Charles knew he couldn't let this go. Not after seeing that pendant. Not after feeling that spark of hope he thought had died years ago. But what neither of them knew was that the past was about to resurface with more force than ever, dragging them into a web of secrets and lies that would change their lives forever. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The cold air of the security room contrasted with the suffocating heat Jessica felt in her chest. The small room, dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light, seemed to close in on her. The head of security, a square-jawed man with a deep frown, reviewed his report without looking at her directly, while two guards watched her with suspicion, as if expecting her to suddenly pull out the missing necklace from thin air. Jessica felt her hands trembling, not out of fear of punishment, but because of the sheer injustice of the situation. How had it come to this? The door to the room swung open abruptly, breaking the oppressive silence. Charles Davis entered with firm strides, his face as serious as stone. The room fell silent at his presence. He wasn't just another passenger. He was one of the most influential men on board, and his mere presence commanded respect. "Leave us alone," he ordered in a deep voice. The head of security hesitated for a moment, but didn't dare contradict him. With a quick nod, he and the guards exited, closing the door behind them. Jessica lifted her gaze, her eyes still red from tears. She didn't understand why this man, a stranger, had intervened. What more could they want from me? Charles slowly approached, his eyes locked onto the small pendant hanging from her neck. "Where did you get that?" he asked in a quiet but intense voice that sent a shiver through Jessica. Instinctively, she reached for the pendant, running her fingers over its smooth surface. "It belonged to my mother," she answered, her voice shaky. "She gave it to me before she died. It's the only thing I have left of her." Her response did nothing to ease the tension in Charles's face. If anything, his expression hardened. "Your mother? What was her name?" "Elizabeth," Jessica said, frowning slightly. "Elizabeth Jones. Why are you asking?" Charles felt the ground shift beneath him. Elizabeth Jones. The name meant nothing to him, but the pendant, that pendant, was impossible to ignore. "Can I see it?" he asked, gesturing toward the locket. Jessica hesitated for a moment, but something in the man's expression, a mix of desperation and hope, made her nod. She unclasped the chain and handed it to him. Charles took the pendant, his hands barely steady. He turned it over slowly, and there it was, a small inscription on the back, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. It was a phrase in Italian that only he and his daughter knew. "Per sempre, Papa." "Forever, Dad." Charles's heart clenched. It can't be. He looked up at Jessica, searching her features for any hint, any sign. Could she be? "Did you know this had an inscription?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jessica shook her head. "I never noticed. What does it say?" Charles didn't answer. He was drowning in a storm of emotions. The possibility that Jessica was his daughter, the one who had disappeared 20 years ago, was overwhelming. But he couldn't let hope cloud his judgment. He needed proof. Before he could form a response, the door opened again. Martine, his personal assistant, stepped inside, his face pale as he held an envelope. "Mr. Davis, I found something you need to see," he said, casting a quick, distrustful glance at Jessica. Charles took the envelope and pulled out an old photograph. The moment he saw it, his expression changed. The image, taken in a coastal villa, showed a young woman who was the spitting image of Susan, his missing daughter, standing beside someone he never expected to see. His own sister, Victoria. Charles's mind flooded with questions. What was Victoria doing in that villa? How was she connected to Susan's disappearance? But what unsettled him the most was Jessica's presence. If she had no idea about her real origins, then how had she ended up with Susan's pendant? He slid the photograph back into the envelope and turned to Jessica. "I need you to tell me everything you know about your mother, where you grew up, any details you can remember." Jessica narrowed her eyes in suspicion. "Why? What does my mother have to do with any of this? I didn't steal anything. and I don't understand what's happening." Charles exhaled heavily, feeling the weight of 20 years of pain and unanswered questions. "Because I believe you might be my daughter." The room fell silent. Jessica felt the air leave her lungs. The idea was absurd. How could this be true? How could this man say something like that after everything that had happened tonight? "That's impossible," she murmured, shaking her head. "My mother, she raised me. She never told me anything about this." Charles didn't press further. He knew it was too much to accept all at once, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. "We need answers," he said finally. "I'm making sure you're not removed from this ship tomorrow, and I'm arranging for a DNA test. This can't be a coincidence." Before Jessica could respond, Martine interrupted. "Mr. Davis, there's something else. I checked the captain's records. The accusation against Miss Jones was filed anonymously, but the documents trace back to someone you know." Charles's expression darkened. "Who?" Martine hesitated for a second before dropping the bombshell. "Victoria." Charles's world crumbled even further. "What is my sister doing?" The coincidence was too great to ignore. Something much darker was behind Jessica's accusation, something far beyond a stolen necklace. As Charles stormed out of the room, determined to confront his sister, Jessica remained alone, clutching the pendant in her hand, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts. None of this made sense, but deep inside her, a small spark of hope began to flicker. What if everything she believed about her life was a lie? Later that night, when she returned to her cabin, she found the door slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened as she slowly pushed it open. The room had been searched. Her belongings were scattered, drawers left open, as if someone had been looking for something specific. On her bed, a note written in red ink awaited. "Leave the past where it belongs, or you'll end up like her." Next to the note was a photograph, one of her adoptive mother, and beside her, a blurred figure that Jessica couldn't quite identify. The threat was clear, but Jessica was no longer willing to stand by and do nothing. The truth was closer than she had ever imagined, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered it. Jessica, however, hadn't slept all night. The threatening note still lay on the small table in her cabin, next to the photograph of her adoptive mother. That blurred figure beside her raised more questions than answers. Who wanted her to leave the past behind? What danger was hidden on this luxury cruise? As the ship continued its course, Jessica made her way to the meeting point agreed upon with Charles Davis. The cafe on the upper deck was nearly empty, with only the soft clinking of porcelain cups at the counter breaking the silence. Charles was already waiting at a secluded table, his face set in a grim expression. There was no trace of the powerful, imposing man that everyone feared. In his place was a father trapped between hope and fear. "Are you okay?" Charles asked the moment she sat down. Jessica nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. "I found this last night," she said, sliding the note and photograph toward him. Charles took the photo, his eyes scanning every detail until they landed on the blurred figure. His jaw tightened. "This man looks familiar, but I can't remember where I've seen him before." Jessica lowered her voice as if afraid someone might be listening. The note said to leave the past behind. "What do they think I'm about to uncover?" Charles exhaled deeply, rubbing his face with both hands. "I think this goes far beyond the theft accusation. There's something on this ship, something that involves my family, and now you, too." The tension between them was palpable. Jessica wanted answers, but the idea that her life was intertwined with this man she barely knew left her reeling. "You said you believe I'm your daughter," she finally murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't make sense. My mother, she raised me. She never mentioned anything about this." Charles nodded slowly, understanding her confusion. "I know, but the pendant, the inscription, and now this," he said, pointing at the photograph. "We need to find the truth, Jessica. We can't ignore the signs." Before they could continue, Martine, Charles's assistant, appeared in a hurry. "Mr. Davis, I got the records you requested. There's something you need to see." Charles took the documents Martine handed him and began reading. Within seconds, his expression shifted from disbelief to barely contained rage. Jessica watched, feeling her own heart pound faster. "These records," Charles muttered, "show that my sister Victoria bought property in the same village where you grew up. And it wasn't recently, it was 20 years ago, right after my daughter disappeared." Jessica felt the ground vanish beneath her. Victoria? What did Charles's sister have to do with her adoptive mother? Charles shot up from the table. "I need to speak to Victoria. Now." Jessica followed him, her mind racing. As they walked through the cruise ship's corridors, memories of her childhood in the village mixed with the shocking revelations. There were moments she had never fully understood. How her mother always avoided certain questions, the letters she burned in secret, the mysterious visitors who arrived at night. They reached Victoria's private suite, but just as Charles was about to knock, they heard voices from inside. "What are we going to do if he finds out the truth?" a woman's voice asked. Jessica recognized it instantly. "Victoria, we'll handle it. Like we always have," a deep, calculated male voice responded. Charles exchanged a glance with Jessica. Without a second thought, he threw the door open. Victoria, elegantly dressed, turned toward them with a fake smile that never reached her eyes. Beside her stood a man Jessica didn't recognize at first, but when their eyes met, an icy dread ran through her. It was the blurred figure from the photograph. "What is the meaning of this, Charles?" Victoria asked with feigned surprise. "Why are you barging into my room like this?" Charles wasted no time on pleasantries. He raised the photograph, holding it in front of her. "What were you doing in this villa, Victoria? Who is this man?" Victoria kept her poised expression, but the slight tremble in her hands betrayed her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied in a carefully controlled voice. "That photo proves nothing." But Charles wasn't fooled. "Stop lying. What did you do to my daughter?" The man beside Victoria stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Jessica. "You should have left things as they were," he murmured, his voice low and menacing. Before Charles could react, Victoria broke the silence with a confession that left them frozen in place. "Susan never disappeared," she said quietly. "I made sure she was taken far away, to protect our interests. But I never expected her to resurface, especially not here." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica felt the world collapse around her. Could this be true? Had her entire life been a lie? But before anyone could process the revelation, the man beside Victoria pulled out a gun, pointing it directly at Charles. "I won't let this ruin everything," he said coldly. Chaos erupted in the room. Charles stepped between the gun and Jessica, while Martine, who had discreetly followed them, burst into the room and swiftly disarmed the attacker in one fluid motion. The ship's security team arrived moments later, restraining the man in handcuffs as Victoria screamed, denying any involvement. Jessica, still in shock, clutched the pendant around her neck. How had it come to this? The woman she had believed was her mother had raised her with love, but now she knew there were dark secrets behind that life. Charles, visibly shaken, turned to her. "We're going to figure this out. I'll have a DNA test done. We need to know the truth." Jessica nodded, knowing there was no escaping the past anymore. The truth was close, and though she feared what she might uncover, she needed to face it. As security escorted Victoria out of the suite, she cast a final venomous glare at Charles. "This isn't over." Jessica and Charles remained in the room, surrounded by the shattered remnants of their past. But one thing was certain, they were no longer alone in this fight. Jessica, still trapped in the weight of Victoria's confession, couldn't stop thinking about the web of secrets surrounding her past. As she walked through the cruise ship's corridors, she felt the furtive glances of the crew, as if they all knew more than they were letting on. Fear was beginning to mix with determination. Charles, on the other hand, had wasted no time. Gathered in his cabin with Martine, he combed through documents and financial records that linked Victoria not only to Susan's disappearance, but also to a smuggling network operating on the cruise. "I always knew her ambition had no limits," Charles murmured, his fingers drumming on the table. "But I never imagined she'd be capable of something like this." Jessica appeared at the door, her face pale but resolute. "We need answers. I can't just sit around waiting anymore." Charles nodded, understanding that patience was no longer an option. That night, They decided to investigate the ship's cargo hold, the place where Jessica had overheard rumors of suspicious activity. With Martine's help, they accessed it through a passageway used by the crew. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with silence. As they walked between large containers, Jessica stopped suddenly, her gaze locked onto something familiar. A crate bearing the logo of the company her family had once owned before their downfall. Charles crouched to examine it closely, his expression darkening. "This is bigger than I thought." Before they could investigate further, they heard hurried footsteps. Quickly, they hid behind a stack of containers, holding their breath as two men walked past, speaking in hushed voices. "Victoria said this would be the last shipment before the deal is closed," one of them muttered. "After this, everything gets cleaned up." The words echoed in Jessica and Charles's ears like a death sentence. When the men disappeared down the hall, Charles turned to Jessica with a grave expression. "We have to stop this. It's not just your past at stake, Jessica. It's an entire criminal operation." Back in their cabins, they began planning how to confront Victoria and expose the smuggling ring. But before they could act, Jessica found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a simple note: "Stop, or you'll end up like your mother." Next to the note was a photograph of her adoptive mother, but this time, the once blurred figure beside her was clearly visible. It was Victoria, younger, standing right next to her. A cold shiver ran down Jessica's spine. What role had her adoptive mother played in all of this? The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together in ways she had never imagined. The next day, Charles and Jessica confronted Victoria in her luxurious suite. She greeted them with a cynical smile, as if nothing had happened. "Have you come to accuse me again?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of wine. "We know what you did," Charles said firmly. "Not just with Susan, but with all of this." He placed the documents and evidence they had gathered on the table in front of her. Victoria flipped through the pages without losing her composure. "And what are you going to do? Do you really think anyone on this ship will believe you? I'm a Davis. The word of a waitress and a bitter brother means nothing here." But Charles wasn't backing down. "Justice isn't about last names, Victoria. And I'm not alone in this anymore." Before Victoria could respond, the door burst open. Several crew security officers entered, followed by port authorities who had been alerted by Charles. For the first time, Victoria paled, her facade of control beginning to crumble. As they placed her in handcuffs, she cast a final venomous glare at Charles. "This isn't over. There are things you don't understand, brother." But Charles held her gaze without wavering. "I understand enough, and you will pay for everything." As the door closed behind Victoria, Jessica felt a mix of relief and sorrow. She had uncovered the truth, but the cost had been high. Charles stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No matter what we discover next, I know now that you are my daughter, and I won't let anything harm you again." Jessica nodded, knowing that the road to the full truth was not over, but at least now, she wasn't facing it alone. Inside Charles Davis's private suite, the atmosphere was anything but calm. On the table, the envelope containing the DNA results lay waiting, filled with answers that could change their lives forever. Charles held it with tense fingers, his heavy breathing filling the silence of the room. Jessica, standing on the other side of the table, felt her heart pounding so fiercely it almost hurt. "Are you ready for this?" Charles asked, his voice rough with a mix of anxiety and hope. Jessica nodded, though the truth was that she wasn't. She had never imagined her life would take such an unexpected turn, that the necklace she had always believed to be a simple inheritance from her adoptive mother would open a door to a past she didn't know existed. Charles broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out the papers. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then suddenly stopped. Emotion stormed across his face. "You are my daughter," he whispered, letting the words hang in the air before repeating them more firmly. "You are Susan." Jessica's world stopped. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. With trembling hands, she took the papers and read the words that confirmed the impossible. Charles Davis wasn't just a powerful man who had crossed her path by chance. He was her biological father, the man who had mourned her disappearance for over 20 years. But the euphoria of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the shadow of betrayal. Charles's mind wasted no time connecting the pieces, and what he saw filled him with fury. Victoria, his own sister, had always had access to his family, his businesses, his secrets. Now, the evidence pointed to her being behind Susan's abduction. "I can't believe it," Charles muttered, clenching his fists. "Victoria, she planned all of this." Jessica watched him in silence. Part of her wanted to celebrate finding her father, but another part was consumed with rage at having lived a life built on lies. They decided to confront Victoria that very night. They couldn't wait any longer. The meeting was arranged in one of the ship's private lounges. Victoria arrived on time, wearing her usual air of superiority. She was dressed elegantly, her eyes gleaming with confidence, until she saw the documents on the table. Charles wasted no time. "We know what you did," he said coldly, locking eyes with his sister. "You kidnapped Susan. You destroyed our lives out of greed." Victoria arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "What are you talking about? Kidnapping Susan? That's absurd." Jessica stepped forward, her voice firm despite the tension. "Stop lying, Victoria. We have proof. We know my adoptive mother was connected to you. We know you wanted to eliminate me as an heir." For a moment, Victoria held her facade, but the pressure was too much. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "And so what if it's true? Charles, you were always the favorite. Everything for you, nothing for me. Did you really think I would just stand by and watch while your perfect little family had everything, while I was nothing more than a shadow?" Charles stepped closer, his face hard as stone. "You traded Susan's life for your ambition. That is unforgivable." Victoria let out a cold laugh. "And what are you going to do? Call the police in the middle of the ocean?" Charles didn't need to answer. At that moment, the door burst open, and several crew security officers entered, followed by port authorities who had been alerted by Charles. Victoria's face drained of color. "You can't do this," she screamed as the officers placed handcuffs on her wrists. "You don't know who you're dealing with." As they led her out of the room, Victoria shot one last venomous glare at Charles and Jessica. "This isn't over." When the door closed, silence filled the space. Charles sank into a chair, exhausted. Jessica sat beside him, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "I found my daughter, but I lost my sister," Charles murmured. Jessica took his hand. "Sometimes, family isn't the one who shares your blood, but the one who chooses to stand by your side." That night, as the cruise continued its course, Jessica returned to her cabin. As she closed the door, she noticed something on the floor. A white envelope slipped underneath. Carefully, she picked it up, her heart pounding. Inside was a note, written in elegant handwriting. "This isn't over. The Davis family still has secrets buried." Jessica looked out her window at the vast darkness of the ocean. She knew that the truth they had uncovered was only the beginning. Victoria Davis had been arrested, but her threat still echoed in Jessica's mind. The note left in her cabin had left her unsettled. This isn't over. The Davis family still has buried secrets. Charles, on the other hand, hadn't slept. His own sister, his blood, had destroyed his life. And though the truth had finally come to light, the sting of betrayal still burned inside him. However, there was one thing he had now that he hadn't in 20 years, his daughter. Jessica was the reason he had to keep moving forward. News of Victoria's arrest spread across the cruise like wildfire. Passengers whispered in the hallways, their faces filled with curiosity and scandal. But what no one knew was that Victoria had made one last move before being captured. She had activated an escape plan, and her accomplices were still on board. Charles and Jessica met in a private lounge on the cruise, alongside Diego, a lawyer Charles had hired to ensure Victoria faced justice. The conversation was quick and direct. "Victoria won't give up so easily," Diego warned, reviewing documents. "She has contacts. We can't let her escape." "I won't let her touch my family again," Charles confirmed. As they planned their next move, a sudden alarm blared throughout the ship. The security system had detected unauthorized access to the cargo hold. Charles and Jessica exchanged alarmed glances. They knew Victoria was behind this. Wasting no time, They ran through the ship's corridors, dodging frightened passengers. When they reached the cargo hold, the scene before them was like a nightmare. Victoria, still in handcuffs, was being helped by a member of the security team, clearly someone on her payroll. But the most shocking part was that she wasn't alone. With her were crates filled with documents and evidence implicating the entire smuggling network operating from the cruise. "Stop, Victoria." Charles's voice echoed through the metallic space. Victoria turned slowly, her cold smile intact. "Do you really think you can stop me, brother? I've always been one step ahead." But this time, Charles wasn't willing to surrender. He stepped forward, while Jessica, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes, blocked the only available exit. Victoria, realizing she was cornered, let out a bitter laugh. "What are you going to do, Charles? Ruin the Davis family name even further? You have skeletons in your closet too." Charles looked at her with a mix of sadness and rage. "I'd rather lose everything than keep living a lie." That was when Diego appeared with port security. After a brief struggle, they managed to subdue Victoria and her accomplices. As they dragged her out of the cargo hold, Victoria threw out one last threat. "This isn't over. There's more than you know, Charles." But neither Charles nor Jessica let her words shake them. They knew the truth was on their side. Hours later, back on solid ground, Charles and Jessica watched as Victoria and the other culprits were escorted away by authorities. The scandal quickly became international news, and the Davis name would forever carry the stain of betrayal. But for Charles, none of that mattered anymore. He had regained what he loved most, his daughter. Jessica, for her part, felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had lived an entire life without knowing her true identity, but now she had the chance to start over. Together with her father, she could build a future without lies or secrets. As they walked through the port, leaving behind the cruise that had witnessed both her deepest humiliation and greatest revelation, Charles took Jessica's hand. "I promise I'll never lose you again," he said firmly. Jessica smiled, feeling a peace she had never known before. "And I promise I'll never let the past control us." But as they walked away, a mysterious figure watched them from the shadows. Holding a phone to his ear, he dialed a number and whispered, "The Davis think it's over, but it's only just beginning." Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.